the participants. So why don't we get started? Today's topic is statistics in neurosurgery. Evan is a very productive resident, and I'm just trying to be like him. So part of the productivity is, being able to do academic research in neurosurgery, and statistics play a big role. I think you can't deny that. You can't deny that statistics is very important to know. And so today's talk is about how both Evan and I have used statistics in our work so far here at the University of Miami Neurosurgery program. And for those that are interested in the program and those that are thinking about applying, these are the sorts of views and insights we have into work. And if you're so lucky to join us, and if we're so lucky to have you one day in the future, it would be nice to think maybe one day we can all work together on these types of projects. So like I said, my name is Victor. I'm a 1, Evan's a 5. And if there are no, feel free to, during the conversation, to use the Q&A box or the chat box, whatever it's called, to put any questions, and either we'll answer them during our presentation or at the end when we open the forum and we have a discussion. I'm gonna talk about types of data that exist and the tests and examples I've used in my my sort of work. Evan will then take over and talk about the clinical meaning and examples that he's worked on, the statistics involved, and then moving forward and being productive. So those are really the highlights. This talk isn't designed to teach you the mathematics behind a regression analysis. That's beyond the scope, but rather I hope by doing this that we can show you examples of statistics in meaningful neurosurgery research, all of which we use here at Miami. So I guess the first question is, what is significance? I think really that's the whole crux of statistics in neurosurgery, significance. And for those that kind of know a little bit, statistics is often measured by a p-value. And this p-value is 0.05. You may have seen this in multiple things. If something's less than 0.05, it's deemed significant. So 2 things. 1, what does that mean? And 2, how much do we rely on that? Well, what it means there's less than 5% chance that your finding is incorrect, and that's arbitrarily defined as something that's significant, as in statistically unlikely not to occur. And then I guess then the question really becomes, in neurosurgery research, a lot of values, no matter what they are, median difference, odds ratio, hazard ratio, they all come with p-values, and they typically talk about 0.05. Evan, I'm going to sort of put you on the spot here and ask what your opinion is on how reliable we are. Like, just if something's a p-value is less than 0.05, do you really think that that's really the whole purpose of statistics in neurosurgery?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that, which is also kind of part of the, my back end of this talk later on, is that, I think it all has to be taken into clinical context. I mean, for instance, right, like if you have, a massive data set, meaning you have thousands of patients, the likelihood that you can find something statistically significant in that is very high. But for instance, if like an odds ratio is 1.05, but the p-value is 0.00001, right? Because you have 10,000 patients in your data set.
What are the statistical tests and examples that we can use in neurosurgical research? What have we used, and what do we recommend? And I think it's very important to recognize there are multiple types of data in neurosurgery. Continuous data describes, for example, I like to think of height. You can be 6 feet tall, you can be 5'9", you can be 5'10", you can be 5'11". It goes in decimal places, and then these types of data, what you can do with that is then you can compare them between groups, between values, and you can see the difference. We'll bring up examples, and the primary 2 examples are student t-test and Wilcoxon Rank test. And we can talk briefly in a second about when you would use either of those. The next type of data you have is categorical, groups. For example, you can think of different outcomes: good, fair, excellent, poor, something with the name, categorical. And these typically then are analyzed using chi-squared values. Chi-squared tests. And there's another thing called Fisher exact test, which we'll talk about shortly. And finally, there are other ways to predict outcomes. And these are typically regression analyses, which you may have heard of. And we'll talk about these in a second as well. But these are just And the question is whether or not, if you give this type of injection at the end of surgery, is the pain control after the surgery any better? And, you know, in terms of pain control using opioids, is that less? And so what you can see here are the results. And the reason I want to show you these results is it's an example of using the Wilcoxon Rank Sum difference. You can see in the study, we found that within the first 24 hours after surgery, those that got the liposomal bupivacaine, LB, had less total opioid use than the controls that didn't. And when there was a statistical difference listed there with a P of 0.03 in the first 24 hours. But in the last, for the remainder of the hospitalization, there was no difference. And so what we used here was a Wilcoxon Rank Sum to see what was the average total opioid use for the LB group versus the control group. Now, the next question would be, well, why did you use Wilcoxon Rank Sum? And the answer is when values are distributed, as you can see, all the blue dots there, all the red dots there, depending on how they're distributed, it indicates what test you should use. That's the really short way of looking at things. The Wilcoxon Rank Sum is used to something that's not evenly distributed. And you can see, at least when it comes to the red dots, they're not evenly distributed. They're not sort of equally spread across that range there. And so we use that. And it's the difference between these two is the nuance of the mathematics. But nonetheless, all these tests produce a p-value. And if there's a p-value less than 0.05, which there is in caption A, then it's statistically significant. And this is an example then of using continuous data in neurosurgery to come up with a statistically significant, in my opinion, meaning, because opioid use is one very important factor typically these days in neurosurgery. And if we can reduce it, the better. This is another paper that's going to demonstrate another type of statistical example. This is one that we looked at the bibliometric analysis of normal pressure hydrocephalus. And what we did here was we looked at the most citing articles based on Scopus. And then we did a number of comparisons of these articles based on different parameters. Here you can see what we've done. And first of all, we've compared, for example, citation count over the years. But more importantly, if you look at the categorical data, we've compared a number of these articles together. We've looked at clinical versus not clinical data. We've looked at neurosurgery, the journal versus not neurosurgery journal. We've looked at articles published in the US versus not published in the US. And we've looked at how many citations and how citation rates that they had and compared them. And this here, at least when it comes to comparing data, is an example of when you would use a chi-squared to look at how many did and how many did not do things. It's categorical, and it still gives you the p-values there. The next paper that I want to talk about is, this is a more complex paper, but what it's going to demonstrate is regression analyses, and it's trying to predict poor outcomes of aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage. What we did in this paper was we looked at these three unique sort of radiographic findings typically associated with subarachnoid. These include delayed cerebral ischemia, DCI. This also includes symptomatic vasospasm, SV, and global cerebral edema, GCE. What we then did was we did these different types of analyses called regression analyses to see if we could find predictors of rebleeding after initial rebleed. And here are the results. There were 455 cases admitted within 24 hours. And what the purpose of this is to show that at the bottom, we used a multivariate regression analysis to say that rebleeding and DCI were independently predictors of poor functional outcome. Now, this is an example of getting data from a cohort, putting it into a study, doing these tests, and then generating findings that are statistically significant to the point now when we go to the ER and a patient has rebled from their subarachnoid, we already know based on this finding alone that independently they're going to have a worse prognosis. Similarly, now that if you take radiographic imaging of these patients and you find DCI present, you can also then show that if you find that in a patient, they're going to have a poor outcome. And so using this univariable, multivariable regression set, we are able then to then come up with these meaningful findings that once we see the patient down in the ER, we're able to then make a judgment on their prognosis. The ins and outs of these analyses are quite complex, but the best way to look at it is when you start, you have an outcome. For in this case, it was functional outcome. And what you do is you take each parameter that you're interested in, whether it's rebleeding, DCI, length of stay, age, gender, presentation, name, whatever you want, and you only use one variable and see if it relates to the poor functional outcome. If it relates to poor functional outcome, that's called a univariable regression. And then what you do is you take it to the next step and you put all the ones that univariably were significant and see if you put them all together, if they still remain significant. If they do, we call that independent predictors. And this is here is an example of multivariable regression analysis, being able to show us that. What I suppose next we want to do is now we want to talk about clinical examples of statistics in practice. Evan was had put these slides together, so
I'm here. I just can't put my video back on. Sorry.
Sure. No. Well, Evan is then going to now talk about the clinical examples from his practice, literally taking the statistics that we've spoken about, and for him to explain how he now uses those findings based on those statistics in his clinical practice.
Yes, I mean, sorry, my dog was like freaking out, so I had to go take care of it with my wife. Yeah, so I think, I think in general, some of the answers that like I was talking with Victor is that, I find that, for me, so just full disclosure, I'm not a PhD. I don't have a background in statistics. So I'm not a statistician. And all of the statistics that I've learned have been in residency. So, with that being said, my feeling, especially coming from the clinical side of things, is that first and foremost, when you're looking at a data set, I think the first thing that you should ask yourself when you're starting to perform statistics is what is the story that you're trying to tell with the data that you have? And you should have an idea of what that is prior to you looking at the statistics, right? And for me, that's what's going to dictate how you evaluate the data that you have. So the reason I say that, and this is also to kind of answer some of the questions that were put in the Q&A. I know someone had asked about, the idea of dichotomizing continuous variables, dichotomizing them, and creating a threshold. And the reason why I think in general that's viewed as something that is frowned upon is because people tend to abuse that in the sense that they do this in order to find something statistically significant that wasn't there initially when they evaluated them as continuous variables. So the reason I say that in this context is because this is a paper that we wrote, a while ago, and this is why I think it's important in terms of evaluating, what is the clinical question that we're trying to answer and what is the story that we're trying to tell with the data. So what we looked at is these patients all with what we call radiation necrosis, which is, we can go into detail about what that is, but we were trying to evaluate whether or not there was a certain threshold of ablation that if we put a laser catheter into these, lesions of radionecrosis and we ablated it, is there a volume threshold that we can reach that would portend a better outcome for these patients? And that's what we did here. So this is an example in which we had a continuous variable, right, in which we have a continuous variable evaluated by volume of ablation, right? And then we dichotomize that into thresholds based on the percent ablation above the initial lesion volume. And then that's how we, evaluated this. So I think this is a perfect example in which we're talking about the use of one, identifying what is the question that you want to answer and what is the story that you want to tell. And if you do that, right, then it makes sense to dichotomize these continuous variables, break them up into categories, and then evaluate them separately in order to see if there is any true difference statistically. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's, at least in my mind, when we're talking about clinical evaluation of these questions, my thought is that anytime you're going into it, especially if someone who's like a medical student who is just learning statistics or has a statistics background but doesn't have as much of a clinical background, I think it's very important that you work with someone to ask yourself the question, what are we really trying to tell here, right? Because you can, Josh, who's a fourth year resident, kind of says like, if you give me any data set, I can find something significant in it, right? So that, that's just a truth of where we are as like a medical community, right? And where we are as this, in terms of, publications, for medicine. And I think, the truth is in between the lines, right? Meaning, what are we really trying to show you and tell you? And if we can do that effectively with not only the story that we paint in the article, but also the statistics, and it reinforces what we're trying to do. So I don't know. I think, I guess there was another, Victor, am I in charge of this now? Can I go to the next slide?
No, I'm still in charge, but I can move it.
No worries. So, I think, it's an important distinction, and what I'll show you too on this next paper, is again, like, this is a paper that we wrote, that was evaluating the effect of hospital teaching status on perioperative outcomes in patients in surgical neuro-oncology. So basically what we were evaluating was, do patients have better or worse outcomes at teaching hospitals who are undergoing surgery for brain tumors? And this is, again, you have to understand your data and understand the limitations of your data in order to answer appropriate questions. So, with that being said, right, the data set that we use for this is something that is, it's like a, large outcomes-based data set that only evaluates inpatient hospital stays, right? So with that being said, right, that means there's huge limitations in the data, right? So if we look at, purely, demographic outcomes, right? So if we look at just, age, race, sex, and, perioperative or preoperative morbidities, and we find statistically significant differences, does that really matter when the hospital length of stay is only 7 days on average or less, right? Meaning that we don't have any follow-up for these patients. We don't know what happened, right? But we really, and the answer is no, right? We know that in surgical neuro-oncology, what really matters is the long-term follow-up. What happens to these patients with brain tumors after they get a surgery, right? And it's not what happens in the first week. It's what happens in the first, 3 to 6 months, first 2 years, right? So what we looked at instead was we asked ourselves the question, if we have this data set, right, what can we glean from this data set that is of value to the community that we're trying to reach, right? And so then the question then shifts from, are we looking at just differences in patients, outcomes in the first 7 days of surgery? Or are we looking at, are there differences in the hospitals, right, that are doing these surgeries, and what are those differences, right? Because that's, in our mind, much more important. And instead of looking at, just simple, differences in the patient population, we looked at, did they have return to OR? Did they have other, perioperative complications such as new neurologic deficits or, pulmonary emboli, something that, is there any difference in that, which are things that do matter in the acute setting. And when you have that question set up, then it makes your analysis much easier, right? So I think, in my mind, that's kind of where we were, and that's where, it was born, this project was born out of that. So I think, what's important for me is, to first ask yourself the question, what do I want to get from this data? And then how can I go about evaluating it? And then that will kind of, for me, dictate what statistics need to occur. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
And then, I don't know if you had another slide for me. I just wanted to, this is another, kind of another example, again, that I just wanted to show you guys. And this is, this is a complete kind of opposite of the last paper. So I think it's a good, dichotomy to show you, is that here we had a large patient data set of a single surgeon. So we had 400 patients with significant long-term follow-up, evaluating, is there any difference in these patient outcomes, based on the way that we prep the hair, the way that we close the incision, and we found that there wasn't. And this is one of these, where the patient demographics and the evaluation of those demographics and the evaluation of, the acute and then long-term follow-up is important. And we have, because this is a single patient, single surgeon chart review of about, 400 plus patients. So it's a much different data set. So I think, just as, rather than belaboring the point, I think, it's important for you to understand, walking into what you have, what are the limitations of my data? What are the questions that I'm trying to answer? And then what kind of picture do I want to paint from beginning to end when I'm writing this paper? And if you do that, I think for me, the statistics then kind of fall in line. It was the same thing. And I also think, like, again, I like the disclosure, like I'm not an expert in statistics. There are many more people who know way more about it than I do, but I can certainly interpret it, and I can do basic statistics. So, for me, what I found to be most helpful is if I know someone like Victor or some of my other friends who are, Josh is one of them as well, and Ian is one of them as well, who is much more well-versed in statistics than I am. It's much easier to come together with someone and say, hey, listen, here's the question that I have. Here's what I think the data will show. Do you think that these statistics are appropriate for this? And if not, what do you think we should do instead? And I think I think publications are a team sport, especially in this day and age. There is no way that you can get away. It's incredibly difficult to write papers and do good statistics with good data with, a single author or even two authors. It requires a whole village to really put this stuff together. And I think it's important to be, to work with a team and be a team player. And, just recently Victor and I sat down to talk about another paper that we're writing, and it was, more or less to talk about, when you do these statistics on this, let me make sure that I understand what you're telling me. And I think when you put it in that context, that makes it much easier for me to interpret the results and then write a discussion that makes sense to the person who is reviewing it, and then also the community that you're trying to publish for. So I don't know if Victor wants to take a stab at it. I think, what I would say is that, learning. So if you know how to code, already, meaning if you have like an electrical engineering or computer engineering background, this stuff becomes much easier for you, I think, than someone who doesn't. I would tell you it's like learning a different language. I use Stata, which is, Stata is, these are all different interfaces in which you can do different statistics on large data sets. So what I would say is Stata is very robust, but it is limited. I think most people believe that R is probably some of the best, in order to code statistics in. However, I think R is a little more difficult in terms of debugging and learning code, right? I think it's actually it's like almost Python language, right? Is my understanding, Victor?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's Python is a coding language. So R is basically coding in Python, whereas Stata has its own. Stata and SPS have their own coding language, and they also have their own basically databases in which you can look up how to use each function that you are doing in them, in the interface. So I would say in general, I think these are good programs to learn. I would also say, like, if your goal is to work on publications and you know, knock that out, it's at least, I would say, good to learn one of them. I would pick one and stick with it. And if you become very heavy into statistics, you can start delving into other areas. But R is also freeware. I think Stata is freeware too from the university, so you can download it for free through UM if you're a UM student or a resident. So, and then
Good
yeah,
point. You know, even like all these programs have different sort of ease of beginning. I think SPSS is the easiest. I think I used that for a while. And then I use Stata as well now that you know, I think when we first met, that's what we bonded over. We both used Stata. And R is something I think I've wanted to try to get into, but you're right, it's a little bit more advanced level player game kind of thing. But they all effectively do the same thing. For the test that we showed you at the beginning of the talk, all three programs are able to perform them. And you know, personally, I've even gone as far as to use YouTube to if I've ever been lost. I mean, YouTube is a great resource for this kind of stuff. Lots of tutorials, and really, that's all it really is. But like it is with learning a language, the more you use it, the more you practice it, the better you get at it, the more different types of stuff you can do. And so now when Evan and I work on a paper, it's very easy to, you know, like if we understand what tests we need, it's very easy to then execute it and interpret it because we collaborate, and that's the final piece. You know, like as Evan said, you know, a research project, a research publication is never a one person thing, and so as a result, um, it's collaboration and understanding what you know, what you don't know, and trying to find someone that complements you, works with you, or just does the, you know, is heading in the same direction is very important. When it comes to, I think there's a question on the chat asking about, you know, what are our thoughts or what are the most commonly used in neurosurgical research? I think all three programs are. I think, you know, if a research team is luckily enough to collaborate with a biostatistician, it probably would be R that they use. Whereas if you know, you collaborate with someone that has not as much exposure, it could be SPSS or Stata. Ultimately, though, the tests we talk about could all be performed in all these interfaces. And so realistically, for the purpose of neurosurgery research, all three are quite valid. And I think that's going to bring us to our next point, which is pearls. You know, ultimately, statistics is something you can learn. You know, if you haven't learned it already, you can learn it. But how do you then turn the statistics stuff into neurosurgery work? You know, ultimately, that's where our interest is, and that's what we're trying to do. And sometimes it's, in my eyes, sometimes it's best to keep it simple, if that makes sense. I don't think a fancy neurosurgery paper has to involve multivariable regression analyses with post hoc exams and adjustments and confounders. Whilst that's kind of fancy, you know, sometimes you're trying to show something as simple as, say, for example, liposomal bupivacaine reduces pain in opioid use. That's as simple as a comparison of mean values. You know, ultimately you're talking with people in the medical field, you're not talking with people in the statistical field. And I think that's something to remember. We're not trying to like amaze everyone with what statistical tests we know, but rather trying to get to the point, which Evan was saying earlier, about what are you trying to say, what is useful, and is it interesting? Because I think you need to answer these three things first before you do it. Just because you can do statistics on a question in neurosurgery doesn't mean it's actually going to be clinically useful. It's not necessarily going to be interesting, et cetera, et cetera. For example, you could say that someone that presents at an older age is expected to live shorter, but that's a general exception. Even though you can statistically prove it, it doesn't necessarily mean you've used the statistics that will contribute to the field. And I think that's the last thing I'll say before Evan might share his thoughts, is that, you know, when you're trying to be productive, a lot of the reviewer feedback is, what are you contributing to either the field, the journal, the specialty? What are you adding that's not already there? I don't think statistics can only add so much, if that makes sense. A chi-squared test will be a chi-squared test for years to come. That's not going to change. You're not adding anything new by doing a chi-squared test. What you're adding new is if there's a new finding, if there's a new pattern, if there's a new trend. And that, I think, is really where statistics then helps you create the paper to be productive. What do you think, Evan?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you know, I agree that, like, you know, part of it is also, you know, knowing your audience and knowing what you're trying to communicate. You know, I think, you know, you can create a lot of results from a small amount of data, right? You can look at it many different ways. You can do different analysis. And I think the important thing is trying to to hone that in into what's important. I've found that, you know, like for the most part that, you know, when you're talking to doctors, odds ratios, I think in many regards, especially if you're talking about an intervention or a treatment, are more helpful for understanding that treatment and that outcome than talking about a number of different things. And the reason is because most people in medicine at least understand what an odds ratio is. So meaning that, you know, you can say, you know, if the odds ratio of, you know, X, you know, intervention having X complication is this, right? You know, then people understand, oh, that is statistically significant and it's higher than one, or, you know, very large. So that means that, you know, they can interpret that easily. On the other hand, you can put, you know, like Victor said, you can put a bunch of different results and nonsense into a publication. But I think what happens is that people get confused when they start reading it, and then the importance of what you're trying to say gets buried in the information that you're giving. So I think, you know, it is very helpful. And then again, you know, like we talked about earlier, you know, you know, if you have large enough data, you're going to find something significant. But what does that mean? And I think, again, you know, this is this thing where I talk about, you know, I'm a fan of odds ratios when you're evaluating some type of intervention or something that you're doing, because it helps me interpret the data, right? If my odds ratio is 1.0001, but the p-value is, you know, 0.0001, well, that's nothing, that doesn't mean anything clinically, right? Because the odds ratio is basically 1. The fact that it's statistically significant means nothing clinically, right? Because I would never change my practice for something, you know, that has an odds ratio that is basically 1. So I don't know. I think, you know, that's my 2 cents on it. I think it's, you know, it's important to know your audience, to understand what question you really want to ask, and then you can tailor the statistics to that based on that. You know.
Yeah, no, I think so too, and I think now is kind of a good time. These resident hours aren't designed for us to be talking for an hour. They're really designed for us to try to interact with people that are listening on this forum. And so now we have a couple of questions rolling in. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and then it's a chance for Evan and I to just share our own views, and for you guys to get an open and honest sort of like conversation dialogue happening with the residents here at the University of Miami Neurosurgery. So we can just go in the order that they've come in, I suppose. I think the first question from Wasim is that when would a Kruskal-Wallis test be used? Now, that is a sort of high level question, I think, for many people that haven't been exposed to statistics. But ultimately, I think the best way to summarize this is, for a lot of neurosurgery research and statistics, you're comparing groups. For example, you're comparing guys versus girls, or you're comparing elderly versus young. In the case where sometimes you have 3 groups, for example, extent of resection, you can have biopsy, subtotal, total, radical, something like that. You could have various layers. If there's more than 2 groups, you can't just do a one-by-one comparison, because ultimately you can't, because you have so many. And so that's when this test called Kruskal-Wallis test could be used to compare the continuous data. What I think the learning point for everyone here is that even though we've talked about some basic tests today and how we've used them in neurosurgical research, there are so many tests out there for different situations, and this is why people employed by statisticians. There's so many to pick the right one. The ones we've talked about are the basic ones, but there are many more to think about. So one such example is a Kruskal-Wallis test. What else have we got, Evan? We have...
Yeah, I would say so. I guess Karen asked for these multivariable linear regression, analyses. How many variables did you use? I mean, the answer is that many people have been moving towards the idea of using only variables that make sense clinically, right? So I've even had like reviewers on papers say like, why did you include this in your multivariable regression? It doesn't make sense clinically and has no known effect on this outcome that you're evaluating. So I think, what I would tell you is that when you're doing this, especially in clinical research, you need to basically ask yourself, does this variable make sense in my evaluation of whatever outcome I'm looking for? And if it doesn't, then you can justify it, and I think this is similar to what Victor was talking about, when we're talking about what is statistically significant, right? It's an arbitrary value that currently that's what we use, right? But, does it need to change? Maybe, right? But, I think if you have a reasonable justification for why you did not use a certain variable, then that's okay. And I think it's understandable. And it actually makes, in my mind, makes the argument for what you're doing a little bit more sound. If you intentionally evaluated each variable and said, does this make sense for the outcome that I'm looking for? I hope that answers that question. But I think arbitrarily putting in every value for a multivariable analysis, you can do it. It requires a lot of computing power. And most of what you're going to find is that many of them have no value at all, meaning that there's no statistical significance, and they don't predict anything in terms of your outcome. So,
Excellent. Yeah, agreed. The next question comes from Mark, who's asking, there's a lot of types of regression analyses out there. Evan's talked about univariable, multivariable, but there's many different types. There's linear and Cox regression, for example. And his question is, how do you go about choosing the right type for your regression? And this is taking statistics a little bit further than, the nuances of neurosurgery, but ultimately how a value relates to the outcome can be in two ways. It can either be linear, as in it's proportional. So, as one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down, or vice versa. Or it can be non-linear in the sense it could be parabolic, it could be inverted, it could be V-shaped, it could be many things. And so ultimately, having a sense of what the trend will be will assist you in that. If it's something that you can really be sure is linear, then by all means a linear type of regression analysis is something. But otherwise, if ever in doubt, Cox regression is a non-linear analysis which can compute linear relationships as well, just not to the same degree of accuracy. And so I would, however, in this case, if this is the first time you've ever tried to expose yourself to these regression analyses and you're trying to think about which one, either phone a friend, do some more reading, and just see what type of data has been used before. But there are different ones, and it really depends on the what you expect the observation and the outcome to how they are going to relate to. Now, the next question comes from Savina. How are you able to pull data across different hospital systems? Oh, Evan, that's a good one for you.
Yeah, I guess we usually just, all of us have access to the medical record for these patients. If you're asking about that specific project, we have we use what's called a national inpatient sample, which is a de-identified evaluation of all inpatient admissions in the U.S. For any given year. So I guess if that's what you're referring to, that's how we evaluated that. So, but again, right, that's the important thing is that you have to understand the limitations of your data. So going into that, we knew that the data was very limited because it's only a snapshot of that inpatient stay. And so then we have to ask ourselves, if we have all this data, it's good data, there's a lot of it, but what can we do with it that makes sense? And obviously evaluating neuro-oncology patients long-term makes no sense when you only have 7 days of follow-up. But evaluating perioperative outcomes, meaning did they come to the hospital, get surgery, and then what happened in the hospital, that's something that we could look at. And, when we did, we found, pretty good data to suggest that, teaching hospitals, actually the patients had fared better. Which you wouldn't expect, right? If you're in an institution where there's, residents and fellows who are learning. So I don't know, it was helpful for us to see that. But I think that's what you're getting at, is that that's how I was able to do it. It's provided online. You just have to pay for it.
The next question comes from Kamal. I'm going to summarize it. Kamal's question is sample size calculations in neurosurgery research. In neurosurgery, pathologies or outcomes that are particularly rare, how do you go about trying to figure out statistical outcomes if the sample size is so small of events? This is a great question. Ultimately, statistics requires there to be a significant statistical power for us to obtain statistical significance. That p-value that you've written there, 0.05, it's an arbitrary decision. And if you ever have heard of power calculations, that's the whole point of a power calculation, to figure out how many cases you need to obtain statistical significance at 0.05. You're almost asking, how much do I need to obtain the significance that's been arbitrarily set? Which, I mean, is why all these papers at the beginning were written. Ultimately, I think if you're trying to get to how my take on this is that in neurosurgery, there are many rare things. Every day we come across rare things, rare presentations, rare outcomes. Unfortunately, not all, just because they're rare doesn't mean we can do a statistical analysis on them. And sometimes when you can't, there are other ways to deliver, your interesting findings. That could be a case report. It could be a literature review. It could be a case series. Unfortunately, if you're trying to think of big cohort studies for rare things, you're going to be pushed, because in neurosurgery, you do need that statistical power. So as great as statistics is here in neurosurgery, it is limited in the sense that we can't make very in-depth findings if our cohort sizes are very small, unfortunately. So that's my take on it.
So for Vikram, is it possible to learn these as a medical student with no statistical or computer background? Or would it be more efficient? I mean, this is what I would tell you, is that it is certainly possible to learn it. I was an engineer in college, so it was a little easier for me to learn Stata just because I had experience coding before. But I would tell you that, it's an endeavor. I mean, it's like learning a different language. So if you're really trying to do some papers that require some heavy lifting in the stats department, and you don't have any prior experience, I would say that the answer is that it may be better to find someone who does, or the opposite is just put in the effort up front, and then you'll be able to really do everything independently. I mean, for myself, I've been lucky enough that I have, enough, friends and colleagues who are highly proficient in statistics. And so a lot of that, I allowed them to do much of the heavy lifting, because, for me, it would, take a lot longer for me to figure out how to do what we're trying to set forth, but I think for others, if you don't have that resource, sometimes it may be easier for you to just really put the time in and effort early on in order for you to be able to do everything completely independently.
Yeah.
There's definitely, I mean, YouTube will teach you how to do things. And the other thing I would say, Stata has a really robust dictionary, basically. So, you can Google can I do this in Stata? And then it'll show you exactly how to do it. So, I mean, it's possible.
The next question comes from Amen. Are there some statistical methods inappropriate for use in a clinical setting? That's a great question. I wouldn't say that there are some tests that you would never use in a clinical setting. I think every test can be used in a clinical setting. It just has to be the right one. And it goes back to what Evan was talking about. What are you trying to say? What's your story? And sometimes what your story is may require a particular test, but it may not be the right one, depending if your data is in a normal distribution or skewed. And sometimes if you ever look into the nuts and bolts of things, depending on what test you choose, you can get that p-value under 0.05, even though it might not necessarily be the right test to use. And so I do think some tests are used inappropriately, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And it's up to, I guess, the reader to be savvy of this. And unfortunately, we're medicos, we're in the medical field, we're clinicians, we're not statisticians. So there's a bit of trust inherent in the literature. And I do think, in the short answer to your question, AM, is that yes, there are sometimes, in my eyes at least. Miguel's question is, do you have anything to suggest to learn basic statistics? Any textbooks in particular? I don't have any, Evan, do you?
No, but I know that there's like, I actually have like there's like a textbook for Stata, I think, that has like chapters like through it. I have it on my laptop, I think, actually. That is pretty helpful in terms of teaching you, kind of going through, line by line, how to write this code and do it effectively. I would say that, you can probably, like, at this point, there's probably a ton of resources available online to teach you how to do specific biostats. And I would say that, if you're really truly looking to do statistics on a certain data set, you can probably Google and say, how do I do X, Y, and Z, in Stata or in R or in SPSS, and it should be able to show you. So.
The next question from Jamie is, could you also discuss the value of literature reviews? Oh, yeah, well, I've done many of these. I think, literature reviews have a place in the literature of neurosurgery. Whether or not they replace any particular study, I think, is a separate issue. I don't think they ever replace it. I think there is a role for them. They provide like a nice quick hit of what the current literature says about a particular topic. But it does not necessarily mean, just because the literature says something, it does not necessarily mean it will give you perhaps the algorithm or the protocol to manage something. For example, if the topic is sinus thrombosis, for example, you could do a literature review about all the different management types of sinus thrombosis, and then you could present it as the literature says, this is what the most common approach is, etc., etc. However, a systematic review itself is not going to tell me, when I see a patient in the ER with sinus thrombosis, what exactly I need to look for, what exactly I need to see, what exactly I need to order. And so I think, the academic literature needs both. It needs, quick hits of the summary stuff, but it also needs a sort of algorithm producing data, which comes from cohort studies. So there is a place for these. I do think the trend in the current literature is they're increasing to the point now where there's a sort of oversupply and they're starting to plateau, and the quality of them perhaps is being questioned a little bit over the quantity, because of the quantity. But I still would argue there is a place for them. And I wouldn't say they're better or worse. I would just say they're different from statistics.
Yeah. And what I would say is that it's also, so for me personally, what I usually tell people is that if we have a case report of something cool, right, that like, I think this is like a cool treatment of a rare disease, or, something cool that happened, but, there is something reported similarly but different, if that makes sense. I find that like literature reviews are the way to make it still more enticing to the journal, to be honest with you. Meaning that if you provide an evaluation of this case and with a cool different spin on either the pathology or the treatment or whatever, and then you also provide a literature review of like what's available, that for me makes it much more robust. And if I'm a reviewer looking at the paper, it makes me much more inclined to say these people understand the topic and understand why their case is different. So like, as an example, there was one where I wanted a medical student that I gave a project to. It was like a multifocal ganglioglioma, which is like very rare in and of itself, but it was in like a 60-year-old woman, which is like never heard of. So we did a review of all of the cases of multifocal gangliogliomas, which were, as we would suspect, all in pediatric patients. We reviewed the locations of the different tumors, and then said, like, now we also present this case where we have biopsy proven multifocal ganglioglioma in a 60-year-old, right? And that's, that's why this is different, because it's extremely rare for this to occur in an adult. So I think in my mind, that makes that paper much more robust, and also shows the reviewers that you have a much bigger understanding of the overall picture of this disease process and why your case is different. So for me, that's to me, that's, in my mind, the value of a literature review more than anything.
Oh, awesome. There are a couple of questions that we might pull together in the interest of time. It's kind of like, again, along the lines of trying to start with programming and what type types of books and skills. And the cool thing about this forum is that people are making suggestions. I can't tell if everyone can see them or not. So just in case you can't, I'm just going to read some of them out. Some people recommend Data Camp, DATACAMP, for those that want to learn R and Python. Thank you, Brittany. I think that sounds like a great thing. Data Camp, I'm sure we can Google that. Jamie's also mentioned that LinkedIn Learning has amazing and thorough videos. And if you could maybe go through your university, you may be able to access them for free. So that would also be cool. There's obviously, guys, the thing with statistics is there's a lot of resources out there to teach you how to do things. And so it's not, there's no one thing that works for someone, that's going to work for everyone. And so I do recommend, like you're just seeing what these resources are. There's a chi-squared test, for example, is a chi-squared test, no matter what book you read, when you read it, or if you read it online, etc., etc. How to do it on any test. The mechanism is still the same, and how to do it and execute it will most likely come as you go on. Finally, the last suggestion I'll just read before we run out of time is that one great program for SPSS is another paid resource, but with free content, and it's described as LAERD, L-A-E-R-D. I'll say that again, L-A-E-R-D. Statistics is great. So as you can see, guys, online there are many different resources out there. Evan, I think in the interest of time, we might just pick one question here, which I think is interesting for those people thinking about residency moving forward. Is that how did you find that during your time in residency that you had time and the resources to learn statistics, or at least be connected with statistics?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I definitely learned stata for the most part in residency. What I would tell you is that I still, like I said, I am not a statistician. I have a friend who literally went to grad school and got a master's in doing biostats. So for me, I'm lucky in that regard. And also, for the most part, I typically, would come to him with a question, say, hey, can we answer this? Do you think we have does this data, do you think this data is robust enough to answer these questions? And he would look over it and say, yeah, let's do these stats and I'll get back to you. So I'm lucky in that regard. However, what I would say is that, I still have enough understanding that I can interpret the results, and I probably could, force my way through it if I really wanted to. But I would say that, the answer is that, again, this is like a team effort, right? Meaning that if you don't have a ton of background in statistics, there's bound to be a number of resources wherever you are. I mean, some departments have dedicated statisticians, meaning that we don't have that here, but some departments literally have people that just if you go to them with your question, with your data, and they will put it all out there for you, and they'll do it and then come back to you, So I would say that the first thing, before you say necessarily let me just, learn all this on my own and do all this on my own, is that, can I develop a team of people around me that will help me do these things and answer the questions that I have? The important thing is that you need to have good clinical questions, right? Because if you don't, then the data will never make sense, right? Because most of these people who are statisticians don't understand the clinical question, right? So if you go to a statistician and you give them all this information, they're just going to give you a bunch of results that you're not going to know how to interpret. So I think that's my long-winded answer about that, is that I did learn how to use these programs in residency. It is possible. It is more helpful if you have an engineering or coding background, computer science background, but it's not impossible to do it, especially because there's a lot of resources available online. But I would say that, on top of doing that, you can, in parallel, try to find out what resources your department has, or your medical school has, or your friends have. Because what I've also realized is that if you ask your friends, they may know more than you think they do, and they may be able to help you tremendously. So
That's fantastic. I'm just reading through this, guys. Like I said, my name is Victor. This is Evan. We'll probably close it now with, with time approaching. We're both residency is calling, and so we really appreciate your time, your questions, your interaction. Our contact details are listed there if you have any questions. And sorry, that should be Evan.Luther, not Evan Luther, Evan.Luther. Feel free to email, reach out to us with any questions. More than happy to take them there. We appreciate your time, and at the University of Miami, like us residents enjoy spending time and interacting with you guys through this platform. So please, if you have any feedback, again through those emails, let us know. Otherwise, on behalf of Evan and myself, I'd like to thank you guys very much for tuning in. And I'll also say that next time for the Resident Hour, you'll be joined by Dr. Damien Brusco, who will be running these. So thank you everyone for all of this, and I hope we see this continuing. And don't be a stranger. Feel free to reach out. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
See you later.
Bye, man.
Yeah.